Hey, and welcome to the second part of my gear chat. I'm going to do 5 for this because I want to talk about EQs, and there's so many different EQs, and you use so many different EQs in mastering. 2 bits of housekeeping. If my voice sounds weird and I'm constantly touching my nose, it's not because I'm on drugs, it's because I've just come down with like a brutal hay fever attack. It's currently April 27th, my brother's birthday. Happy birthday to my brother, who is the YouTuber Oscillator Sync, if you're into synthesizers. But it's when all of the plants go absolutely mental in the UK and try to attack us with their pollen, try and pollinate our insides. So yeah, sorry about that. I've also noticed, because I'm a mastering engineer, that there's certain frequencies of cone filtering on my voice. It's to do with the dimensions of the room. So if you listen to this on headphones and it sounds like a honking mess, apologies. The topic I want to talk about today is EQs, and I'm going to talk about 5 EQs that I use. I'm going to talk about 1 really important one and then 4 supplementary ones that I like to use. These are all fixed EQs, not dynamic EQs. And they're all things that I use day in, day out for completely different reasons. I'll explain the reasons. They're not necessarily the same reasons that you might find for using these EQs. I tend to use like 2 or 3 bands of certain EQs because I've experimented using them in different places. The first one I want to talk about is my 95% of my EQ is done with this EQ. It's the DMG Equilibrium. I've talked about this a few times before, about how much I love this EQ. It's the most complicated EQ probably under the sun, but it's also the best sounding I've ever used for nuts and bolts filtering, cutting stuff, boosting stuff without trying to excite it in any way. There's a couple of videos about it online. I wish there was more deep dive videos about it without lots of audio examples. I don't really like audio examples for YouTube videos because the context is very hard to judge. I would rather somebody took me through all of the parameters and then gave me their advice on how to test it, and then you go on to demo it. Because it's so easy to demo stuff now. It's like minutes. You just write in a form, download it, and it's on your computer. And then sometimes you've got it for like a month or 3 weeks or whatever. So that's my advice on how to demo stuff. But yeah, DMG Equilibrium is a mastering compressor. It's not a mastering compressor, it's a mastering EQ. I just talked about compressors, didn't I? It's a mastering EQ that can do pretty much anything. I mean, literally pretty much anything, as in like you can do pretty much any shape. You can do mid-side, you can do every... I mean, literally, the amount of filter shapes on it is bonkers. You can do linear phase, you can do minimum phase, you can do a mixed phase mode, you can do different phase modes for different bands. It's sort of overwhelming, but if I had one EQ in the world and nothing else, and it was this EQ, I would be absolutely fine. It's reasonably priced. The support for it is great. It's a British company called DMG, Dave Campbell, who makes it, and he's very interactive with the community. Some people prefer the Fab filter, which is very similar, Pro Q3 I think it's called. There's also the Flux stuff. They're all kind of similar. The Ozone EQ is quite similar, but Equilibrium to me is the most mind-bendingly open, and I like to be able to dive and dive and dive into plugins and keep finding stuff, and yeah, it's absolutely wicked. So that does most of my EQ. When I'm doing the vinyl pre-mastering stuff, I pretty much just use that, and maybe dynamic EQ, which I'll talk about another time. The second one I want to talk about is one that I've been using recently that's come out, which is the Knif or Knif, Knif, I can't remember how you say his name now, sorry if I mispronounced your name, Soma EQ, which is a Plugin Alliance thing, Brainworks made thing. And it's basically a valve EQ think with sort of passive, I can't remember exactly how it works. It's kind of like probably based on stuff like Poltec's, but it's very much modernized, and it has a sound which is less extreme than Poltec's, as in you can have more dBs worth of gain before you get so much of that. I don't want to say saturation because that word gets overused, but the Poltec sound, the hysteresis, the grab, the pinginess, the zinginess of the high frequencies, and the very coloured low end you can get with just 1 dB of a Poltec low boost. It's sort of like a couple of shades cleaner than that, but it definitely enhances the sound in a way that sounds sort of quite sort of 60s, 70s EQ sounding. So I really like that as a sort of midpoint between clean and very affected. The next one I'm going to talk about is one shade cleaner further, which is, they call it, what do they call it? It's an Amek 200, but I've never quite got my head around why it's Amek, because to me Amek is the prosumer Knif stuff. Very high quality gear, but it's, from what I can tell, it's like a GML / Sontec inspired thing. So again, it's an overall mastering EQ with loads of different bands and stuff. But it's only slightly coloured. It has like a little bit of an enhancement when you add all the bands together. I don't know whether it's because of the parallel topology of it, but I like it a lot on most stuff. I used to have a Sontec MEP 250 clone, and it sounds pretty close to that to me, for especially like upper mid boosts and the first order high shelf. The low end is a lot cleaner than the Knif and some other plugins I'm going to go on to, but it's definitely got more colour than just the standard minimum phase DMG. So you can see I'm sort of working with contexts here. I've got different EQs for different amounts of change, really, especially with boosts. But yeah, I really like it. It's worth grabbing. If you've got the Plugin Alliance subscription, then you've already got this, the mega bundle. But yeah, really great for acoustic music where you don't want to add too much colour to it. Sometimes I try a more sort of like, colourful emulation, and then I'm like, no, I'm going to go back to the Amek. Really good interface. It's got the mid-side stuff that's like dead useful. I use it in mid-side a lot, often high shelf, and then a bit more high shelf on the sides, especially if you've got a vocal which is quite bright in the centre. That's quite a good technique to bring up the high frequencies overall without over emphasising the vocal. And yeah, the wide mid bands, that's what I used to use a lot on my Sontec clone. So I found that as a really good replacement. I think I actually got rid of my Sontec clone after I demoed this. That might have been a little bit later on. I can't remember exactly the timeline, but it's something like that. The fourth one I want to talk about is a lot more coloured, but has a real benefit to it that I'll explain. And that's another Plugin Alliance one, which is the Bettermaker Mastering EQ. That's way more of a traditional Poltec sounding EQ. It's like quite coloured. It has a very obvious sound, but it doesn't have the box tone of a Poltec. Now, if you ever used any of these hardware versions of the Poltec program EQs, the way they work is they're a passive EQ circuit, and then you have these sort of like line amp gain stages, which is part of the sound. And it's a really desirable sound, but you don't always want to impart that on the signal. You might get 90% of the amount of colour you want, and you might want to do the rest with an EQ. And then you try a Poltec style emulation, and suddenly the stereo image and stuff changes, and the low mids get a bump, and all this sort of stuff. And what they've done with this Bettermaker is basically made it flat until you do the EQ. So it's kind of like the EQ is the sort of amount of colour that you expect from a Poltec, but you don't have that box tone, which I think is really clever because it allows you to do stuff which you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. It's kind of breaking the science open a little bit to allow you to do stuff. I use this only for extreme highs and extreme lows. Now, the Poltec high shelf, I won't go into exactly why this is, but it's to do with the fact that it's an inductor circuit and you have a certain amount of what's called hysteresis, which is like almost like a memory effect. I actually did my in America it's called a thesis. But my dissertation at university I did on the use of transformers and inductors and what hysteresis does to the sound and how it's a frequency dependent thing. And long story short, inductor EQs have a slightly different sound because of this. They were actually replaced historically because they got a more linear sound from using capacitors, but it has a really cool sound to it. It sort of like grabs the sound and it enhances it, but it enhances it in this sort of like dynamic way. And that's really great on the really highs. If you've got like overheads which sound a little bit too dull, or like I love it on acoustic guitars. It's a classic sound. If you've got the high shelf needs a little bit extra sparkle, the Poltec like 18 kilohertz, absolute chef's kiss moment. And the Bettermaker allows me to do that without getting the box tone, so it's like I can put that last in the chain without changing the overall shape of the mix. And also the low frequencies. The problem is with the Poltec stuff is that the change is so extreme after like 1 dBs that stuff like the Soma, often I'll swap it out for it. So it's the idea of having like really clean, really coloured, and you've got stuff in the middle and you can sort of pick and choose bands from all of these, which I often do, and you build up this really complicated chain that, you know, in real world the hardware would be like the cost of a house basically. And I love the fact that you can do that with the plug-in alliance stuff. Yeah, the low end, again, the Poltec thing, it's a very big sound, but it often sweeps over, even at the lowest frequencies, the effect, the harmonic effect, sweeps over into the low mids, which is really desirable, but not always desirable. So I've often done like a couple of dBs on that and been like, no, it's actually clouding up the low mids a little bit. And then this is why the Knif Soma is so useful for swapping out for doing that. It gives a similar sound, but it's not the same sound, and it gives you a bit more control. The last one I'll talk about is the one that I've had for a long time, which is completely different to these other EQs, which is the Mag EQ4, 4D, something like that. That was originally under a different name, Night Pro Audio, something like that. I actually had an analog emulation of one of these at one point as well. Well, emulation, a clone. Now this is basically a graphic EQ in the sense that it's a split across certain bands, and then there's a high frequency air band which is really famous, which is completely separate from the rest of it. This is like a tone shaper, like an overall tone shaper. It does impart a sound just flat, and the more you change it, it does change the gain a little bit. It's kind of slightly quirky in that sense. But if you just want to like shift the energy from one area of like the mix to another, you can do like a half a dB cut and then a half a dB boost in one place, and it very cleverly shifts the energy down. Really good for taking out the energy from the low mids and putting it into the actual bass. The high shelf is cool sounding, but it's very aggressive. If you've got dark pop vocal mixes or dance mixes, pop dance, the high shelf on it is really good. But the high shelf, I mean the 2.5, not the air band. Now the air band has this really clever thing where it's a really smooth sort of shape, but you can put it really high up. So you can put it at 40 kilohertz, and you might be thinking like, well, you can't hear 40 kilohertz, but you can hear the result of the tone. It's really good for the final bit of brightness. It's been a trick that people use on vocals and stuff a lot. I mean, these are really the hardware is really popular. Really clever piece of kit. A little bit esoteric, a little bit quirky, but well worth grabbing for $20 or whatever when it's on offer. Yeah, people love it on vocals, but also the mix bus, and it can be used in mastering. The sub band's quite cool as well. You can take out a bit of sub and then push up a bit of 40 hertz. If you want to get really deep into the rumble, shape that a little bit. It's a really cool way of doing that. Anyway, I could go on about this for days. EQ, you know, it's the main thing that we do in mastering when we're processing. Really, it's a good like 75% of the processing, I would say, is EQ, limiting, and then compression, probably in that order. The next video I'll talk about limiters and clippers and what I use. This one was a little bit longer, and also I wanted to get in a bit more detail, but I hope that's useful. And sort of like, again, it's about how I've put together my suite of plugins. I do use loads more EQs, when necessary than these. If I do a follow-up video, I might do like my backup EQs or like my sometimes EQs. But those are the ones I use the most at this time. DMG Equilibrium is the big, does the heavy lifting basically, and the other ones are to taste sort of thing. So yeah, I hope this is useful. Not sponsored, not endorsed. You know, these companies are completely welcome to give me free plugins, and then I'll put a paid thing on the videos. But this is just my experience. This is just my what I've learned. So yeah, hope that's useful. Apologies for the weird, even more nasally voice, and apologies for the weird comb filtering on my voice. I can't quite convince my wife to let me put acoustic treatment up in my dining room. I mean, these take up enough space. They're going all the way down this wall you can't see. Plus there's a wall of them upstairs. So yeah, hope that's useful. Like, subscribe, you know, be wicked. Thanks.